Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Tian Zhang, and today I will be presenting my project, which is a research paper with the research question, what were some economic factors behind Singapore's plastic waste exports stagnating after 2020? So first of all, for some background information, introducing Singapore. Singapore is where I'm from. It's a Southeast Asian country that has a very small surface area, but it's very highly economically developed and behaves much like a Western, more economically developed country, both politically and economically. So when I was doing preliminary research for this project, a lot of the studies I found mostly just covered either plastic waste trading between Western countries and Southeast Asian countries, but not specifically about Singapore or Singapore's waste management and recycling domestically, but without much explanation about its waste export market. Therefore, that's why I found a literature gap that there's very little information on Singapore's plastic waste trade specifically, and my research aims to fill this gap. So introducing plastic waste exports, this phenomena occurs because a lot of Western countries, so like for example, Australia, but Singapore is one of those countries as well. They produce a lot of recyclable plastic, but they don't have enough capacity to recycle all of it. So they will export this plastic to another country that can recycle it. Usually this is a developing nation, so Indonesia is one of the major countries who does this. And the Western country will just ship their plastic over and it will get recycled in the developing nation. Um, and recyclable plastic has to be both high quality and uncontaminated, which is very important for some of the factors that I have found later on. So Singapore's plastic waste export market, generally speaking, 90% of the exports in the market are taken up by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Those are Singapore's main importing countries by a large margin. So analysis focuses mostly on those three countries. And the interesting pattern that I noticed that sparked my investigation to begin with was that Singapore's plastic waste exports had decreased every year from 2013, but suddenly stagnated from 2020 onwards. So I really wanted to figure out why this happened, if there was any like larger factors in play here. So a quick note on data collection. So because it involves exports, it was kind of difficult for me to collect firsthand data. So for primary data, I instead used government and independent data sets, most notably Our World in Data and the World Bank's integrated trade data set, as well as reports and news articles for more qualitative data because those sources tend to have more focused information on Southeast Asia and Singapore. So the first factor we will be talking about is a reduction in demand for plastic waste from importing countries. So first of all, a big demand factor was a change in the regional attitudes surrounding plastic waste exports because it all started with China's ban in 2018 on plastic waste imports. And a lot of Western countries were heavily reliant on China to take in their plastic waste. And because China had a ban, they had to swap to Southeast Asian countries instead. But a lot of these countries were heavily harmed by, for example, microplastic contamination, and also their waste management facilities are not like their infrastructure is quite weak, meaning that a lot of the recyclable plastic waste received from Western countries could not be treated in a way that it will actually end up getting recycled. So, for example, in Indonesia, a lot of factories will burn plastic waste to use as fuel, and this caused there's a case study where for example a tofu factory used plastic waste as fuel, and a neighboring egg factory had dioxin levels that were 70 times higher than levels that would have been safe as recommended by EU food regulators. So as you can see, um, the plastic waste trade caused a lot of health issues and environmental issues in Southeast Asian countries. So the importing countries started setting bans and regulations on these plastic waste imports. So, for example, Malaysia and Vietnam both set bans to be implemented in within the future, and Indonesia set stricter regulations on impurities and plastic waste imports. And these regulations signaled a reduced demand for Singapore's plastic waste exports, such that less plastic was allowed in to these importing countries, meaning that countries are less willing and able to receive the imports. The other main factor that reduced the demand of plastic waste exports was the plummeting prices of fuel and thus virgin plastic, because there are two types. Plastic products can be made from two different kinds of plastic resin. One type is virgin, which means that it's made directly from crude oil, and the other type is recycled resin, which is made from um, like basically recycled plastics. Um, recyclable plastic waste. And because there was a fuel price crash, suddenly virgin plastic resin was a lot cheaper than recyclable plastic resin, which was already generally lower quality and thus less desirable. Now, because like uh recyclable plastic is already like relatively undesirable compared to virgin plastic resin. Generally speaking, the market for recyclable plastic products will be subsidized by the government in some way, shape, or form. However, because at the same time as this fuel price crash, COVID was happening, the government's budgets in developing nations, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, all of their budgets were already strained. You can see from this graph here that their budget deficit to GDP ratio all decreased within this time frame, and because they could not spend more and increase this just like to boost the demand for recyclable plastic resins, um, there was nothing stopping the demand for recyclable plastic resin to fall further because of the lower virgin plastic prices, meaning that importing countries' demand for plastic waste imports will also fall because that is what's used to create recycled resin. So therefore, this is another demand factor that caused demand for recyclable plastic waste to fall, including for Singapore. So second factor is supply, of which, unlike demand, where they're kind of compounding factors, the supply factors contradict each other. So the first factor is an increase in the cost of production for waste exporting countries in general, and this includes Singapore. So first of all, as mentioned before, there were a lot of bans and new regulations from the importing countries, but also Singapore was a signee of the Basel Convention, and this was a legally binding agreement where in 2020 they made an amendment to set stricter regulations on plastics. So both the Singaporean government and other importing countries' governments were setting stricter regulations on waste exporting companies in Singapore. Now, this would have increased the cost of production indirectly through regulations and red tape. And how it works is that prior to regulations, a company exporting plastic waste from, like, for example, Singapore to Malaysia, they could use all of their resources. So, in our visual here, we'll use workers as a representative. So all of these workers would be used to produce plastic waste exports. However, now that there are regulations, the company has to dedicate extra time and resources to ensuring that these regulations are being met by either cataloging things or like checking that plastic waste exports are within regulatory standards. So now, as you can see, with the same amount of resources, the company cannot like use all of your resources towards making profit. So the incentive to supply more plastic waste exports would decrease, and therefore supply would decrease. The other increased cost of production is freight costs because of COVID. A lot of like shipping companies. So the exporting firms would have to pay the shipping companies to ship waste overseas, and those were the freight costs. But because of regulations from COVID due to lockdowns, freight companies had increased their prices to an all-time high within this period, meaning that freight costs were also higher for exporting firms. So overall, there was a downward pressure on supply for plastic waste exports. However, the other factor was that the supply of recyclable plastic waste in Singapore increased. Now, there were two things that led to this. The first one was COVID-19, the pandemic. It caused, first of all, a lot more plastic usage for medical or hygiene reasons. So, for example, masks or like extra like plastic packaging, because people thought that would be more hygienic, and this reduced although this was to reduce the virus transmission, of course, it led to a lot more recyclable plastic waste being created by Singaporeans. The other thing was that in their everyday life, due to lockdowns, a lot of Singaporeans had to stay at home. So aside from the mask mandates, they also had to resort to shopping online to buy food, necessities, or anything in general. So, and this trend persisted even after COVID ended because people had already gotten into the habit, meaning that because like when you order things online, there's a lot more plastic packaging involved in general than if you go into a shopping mall and buy something. So that also increased the amount of recyclable plastic waste generated by the Singaporean population. Um, the other thing was that actually Singaporeans had worse recycling habits, which impacted how much plastic waste could be recycled. So what happened was that there was a lot of consistent bin contamination, so that Singaporeans would throw food along with recyclable waste. As mentioned before, if waste is contaminated, it cannot be recycled, and 40% of Singapore's blue bins, which is the bins designated not just for plastic recycling, but for all recyclables, 40% of those bins would be contaminated. So additionally, in single-use packaging, there were a lot of mixed material packaging that couldn't be recycled either, which would, while it wouldn't ruin the entire bin's contents, it would make them harder to sort when recycling. So a lot of the plastics that um, that should have been recycled got contaminated instead. However, because there was such a large increase in the sheer amount of recyclable plastic waste being generated, even though the recycling rates were very low, the amount of um, plastic waste that ended up getting recycled and therefore exported still increased a lot. Now, overall, to evaluate which factor kind of wins out here, we have to consider that Singapore has a very limited recycling capacity domestically. So that means that Singapore cannot actually locally process the huge influx of recyclable plastic waste that was generated due to COVID. Therefore, the recyclable waste has to be exported instead of domestically processed. The other option is to burn it, incinerate it, and landfill the ashes. But Singapore's landfill has been projected to reach capacity by 2035, which means that this is like kind of the worst option available, and a closer substitute would be, in fact, to export it to a developing nation that can recycle the plastic instead. So even if the cost of production of exporting increased, exporting firms were still kind of forced to export all their plastic waste because there was not enough capacity locally to deal with it. So the supply of plastic waste exports still increased overall. Um, Now we will be talking about some barriers to change, which made any significant changes in the market a bit more difficult to have impacts. First is that the inelastic price elasticity of demand, which means that when price increases, the quantity demanded of the good falls less than proportionately. So within our context, that means that if the price of recyclable plastic waste increases, the quantity demanded of importing countries for this plastic waste exports would fall less than proportionately to the price increase. So what this means, the reason why there the PD was inelastic was that importing countries really relied heavily on waste imports to produce any recycled plastic products, even despite negative impacts, because their infrastructure for waste is simply too weak to the point where their own waste would be too contaminated to be used in these recycled plastic products. So while Singapore is not as large of an importer for its main importing countries as some Western countries, there have been no reported incidents of waste contamination in Singapore's imports compared to a lot of Western countries, such as when Malaysia had to return 150 plastic waste import crates back to various Western countries. So we can deduce from this that Singapore exports higher quality waste and less contaminated waste than other countries, i.e., it's actually recyclable, meaning that these developing nations could be reliant on Singaporean plastic waste specifically. So even if prices of Singapore's plastic waste exports change, the developing nations still need it to produce their recycled plastic products, meaning that demand may not decrease as quickly or may not decrease at all. Second thing is that supply is also price inelastic. So when the price of plastic decreases, the supply that Singaporean plastic waste exporters produce also falls less than proportionately. This is because, as mentioned before, Singapore has very limited capacity for recycling because domestically, there's only a small number of private firms that recycle locally, and it's difficult to increase the amount of infrastructure very quickly because infrastructure requires a long time to construct. That's called time lag. So, for example, there were renovations for a recycling park announced in 2023, but it'll only be finished by 2029. This means that should plastic waste should recyclable plastic waste suddenly experience an like dramatic increase as it did in COVID, Singapore cannot quickly account for that locally, so they're forced to still continue exporting. So it's difficult for plastic waste export firms to respond accordingly to an increase or a decrease in price because even if they want to pass off processing to local production, they cannot do that. Hence, Singapore still exported a similar amount of recyclable plastic waste, regardless of cost or other factors, as we can see in this graph over here, where the amount exported, as mentioned before, it was stagnated, even though the amount generated varied a lot. So overall, if we model the market, I tried to model it using a microeconomic market model and kind of evaluated this diagram. So first of all, you can see in the diagram here, I drew the demand curve shifting to the right, meaning a decrease, supply shifts to the left, meaning an increase. So our quantity remains the same, around the same overall, which is what happened in real life. Demand does decrease, and the demand and supply decreases are both also relatively minimal because for demand, we outlined two factors. Both of them are limited by PED. So, for example, even though a lot of importing countries want to stop importing, they can't because they're reliant on foreign waste imports, including from Singapore. And even if virgin plastic is as a substitute of recycled plastic resin is lower in price because the government funds the recyclable plastic market that kind of guarantees a certain level of demand for recycling. Furthermore, supply does increase, but because the factors are kind of it they put opposing pressures on supply curve, therefore the size of the shift is also limited. A major issue with this diagram, however, is that the price decreases when in actuality, looking at World Trade Organization or World Bank data, the price of recyclable plastic waste has increased over time. So an explanation for this could be that because of how inelastic both supply and demand is, price is actually relatively volatile. So there may be another factor in play that's just not exactly visible in this diagram. So for example, because firms are not able to reduce their supply of plastic waste exports, they have to maintain their profits by raising their price, and that's not exactly something that may be accounted for within the microeconomic model. So we may conclude that this type of modeling could be useful sometimes, but it's often also too simplistic to account for additional price factors. So overall, we have found I have found through this research project that the main factors affecting Singapore's plastic waste exports from 2020 to 2022 are both supply and demand shocks from COVID, different countries' regulations, which also have both demand and supply side effects, but also Singapore's domestic recycling capacity being limited. Those are the main big three factors that kind of a lot of them have both supply and demand side impacts. Yeah, so that is the rundown of my research project. Thank you so much for listening.